On today's episode of the Going Commando podcast, we have a loaded one for all you fans. We're talking offseason. We are talking free agency transactions, free agency losses, what's going on around the NFC East, and even some news about potential change in ownership. So, a lot to talk to. We're excited to be back. And without further ado, let's get the show started. Welcome to Going Commando, a Washington Commanders podcast.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Going Commando podcast. My name is Chris and I'm on with my co-hosts Tom and Clark, coming at you with the first episode of the offseason. We're coming off of a 2022 to 23 season, 8-1. A lot of good things and some not so good things, and definitely a lot to talk about. Lots of activity happening so far this offseason for Washington. And I guess, fellas, we'll go ahead and get started kind of with some of the big coaching changes, really, as a starting spot. Scott Turner, obviously no longer in Washington. A lot of family ties with his dad to not only the area, but also Ron Rivera. So it was definitely a little shocked to see that, but also not so shocked in other ways. I guess, fellas, what is your initial reaction to the Scott Turner firing?
First off, it's good to be back. It's been a bit of a hiatus here for us here at Going Commando, and it's great to hear all of your wonderful voices yet again. But as for Scott Turner, this is something that us fans had probably been clamoring for here for a couple of years. Now, I don't think that it's completely fair to blame all of our offensive woes on this guy. I think there's been some decisions that have been made, perhaps starters being put in certain games in key situations late season. We'll probably get to that later, but I think it was good to see, and it was good to see that this front office and coaching staff and ownership and everybody decided to make a change. They largely kept a lot of this coaching staff the same throughout the time, with the exception of maybe some position coaches being changed. So it was definitely nice to see, in my opinion, this organization decide to move on from Scott Turner and go in a different direction.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, Clark. It is great to be back. Absolutely missed this, especially with you boys being around and getting able to talk to you about, Commanders news. As for Scott Turner, I mean, this is something that we've been harping on basically all season. I think we all had a lot of issues with the offense, and I agree with you, Clark, that it's definitely not all Scott Turner's doing, but it definitely felt like some of the play calling. Specifically, I can remember us talking about that Jonathan Williams pitch play on third down, which made absolutely zero sense to any of us. I mean, there's just stuff that he did, which as a fan you see and you kind of feel like it's unacceptable. And as an organization that's kind of trying to change its image and really start to move towards a winning tradition with our young, talented group, I think it's a big sign that we are, sort of moving on and getting rid of the last vestiges of this former Redskins team, now Commanders team. I think the biggest thing is who we filled the spot with. And when you compare the guy that we added to the guy that we fired, I mean, there's absolutely zero discussion about whether or not we upgraded. I absolutely believe it was an upgrade. I think that Scott Turner leaving was necessary for this team to get over some hump. Obviously, there's going to probably be a little bit of growing pains now that I said that. But as you guys know, this is kind of, this is the new guy's spot to make his name, not only with the league, but without his former team, which we will talk about later.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think with Scott Turner gone, hopefully we'll see a little bit less of kind of questionable decision and play calling that we saw. A lot of times I feel like, plays were called in situations that didn't make, a whole lot of sense. And we saw that time and time again over the season. So really excited with the signing of Eric Bieniemy. I think he comes with a really a fresh face, a fresh approach to the offensive scheme. Obviously had a lot of success in Kansas City. Worked very closely with Andy Reid, arguably one of the best coaches in the NFL. And I'm just really excited to see what he can do. I like his running backs kind of background. Curious to see what elements he adds to our run game as well as the offense as a whole. And interesting to note that they really seem to also not only was he obviously appointed the new offensive coordinator, he also hosts the title of assistant head coach, which I thought was interesting to see. There's obviously been a lot of talk over the last couple off seasons about, hey, when is Eric going to be, offered a head coaching position or hired as a head coach of an NFL franchise? This is absolutely one step closer to that. And I'll be curious to see not only how he runs the offense, but how much of a leadership role and position he takes in relation to, Ron Rivera still ultimately being the head coach.
Yeah, and that's a really good point that you make there. I think one of the things that we forget, especially considering the season we had, is that at one point we all kind of thought that Ron Rivera might be fired and out of the building. Then we end up winning a game here or there, and he starts to look a little bit better as a head coach. And let me be the first to say on this podcast, if he does become our head coach next year, which in all likelihood he could, but he might be moving for something a little bit higher up on the value chart. I would be completely fine with him being our head coach. I mean, he does need to prove himself a little bit. He did have Patrick Mahomes, and that's certainly a guy that when you have, and arguably going to be, a 3 or 4 time MVP in the NFL as your quarterback, you're going to look like a pretty good offensive coordinator. He did work along one of the best offensive head coaching minds with Andy Reid in Kansas City. So he certainly knows his football chops, and he's one of those guys that either is going to get us over whatever hump we need to get over, or he's going to, put us closer to a winning position, regardless of whether that's just going, slightly better record or even making it to playoffs and kind of having a run. I'm excited to see what he does with the team. And I think that this team has a lot of young offensive weapons and a lot of directions that it can go in. And I think that this is a spot where he can kind of put his own signature on whatever the offense is, and it will really be showing the next few years, assuming he doesn't move on from us and take a head coaching role.
But that's something that I would kind of want to touch on is the status kind of that this guy has entered the building with. For years now, he's been the hottest, head coaching name that hasn't gotten the job. And, we might want to think to ourselves why that is. Why hasn't he gotten an offer yet? You look at the success that Kansas City has had, and, you look at all these other coordinators getting hired. What is it about him that's taken this long? And so, for us fans of the Washington Commanders, we bring in this guy from Kansas City right off the bat. It's, eye popping. We got this guy that's, won a bunch, multiple Super Bowls, all this, yada, yada, yada. But I mean, to be honest with you guys, I don't want to get our hopes up, too immensely. I mean, we've seen some great offensive minds come through this building many times. We've seen some of the best offensive coaches in our coordinator spots in Washington. And we've seen that with the McVays and the Shanahans and the LaFleurs and all those guys. So, I mean, what is about this guy that's all of a sudden magically going to fix the job? And I know I'm being a bit of a pessimist here, but I mean, do you guys think that this guy, this is any different from any of the other offensive masterminds that we've had come through our doors?
Well, speaking candidly about the head coach, I mean, you do make a great point. He's a guy that has been in discussions, and he kind of reminds you of those guys, the LaFleurs and obviously the McVays. I mean, speaking candidly, he was kind of regarded as a character issue guy. I mean, it was a joke made by one of our friends when a friend of ours asked who he was, and the guy said, "Well, look at his personal page and his legal issues." I think the legal issues were a really big issue for some of the teams in terms of being a guy that has to be a leader of a team as the head coach. That being said, this guy, he's had weapons and he's also made do without some weapons. I mean, that Chiefs team has had a lot of turnover between the two Super Bowls, and you go from a guy, like Tyreek Hill to Juju Smith-Schuster, who are two very polar opposite receivers in their play style, and he makes it work with both of them. So I think seeing his ability to be flexible and kind of this rubber band mentality of snapping things back into place when they kind of get stretched a little thin. I think that's really what the difference maker is. Whereas Sean McVay, I mean, we've seen him run through so many different tools on that Rams team and not really find the same magic he found that one year. So that's at least for me what I think is the separating factor.
Agreed. And I think consistency is something that this team has been yearning for years. And hopefully that's something that the enemy can bring. Obviously with the continued and sustained success he's been able to have in Kansas City over the last several years. I think he's a guy that the players are really going to like and gel with and respect and play for. I don't know if Scott Turner had I'm not saying Scott Turner had a poor relationship with the players, but did he have that great of a relationship with the team? Were players identifying with what he was telling them and listening and wanting to follow him no matter what he's telling them? I do think I do remember a couple of times during the season where murmurs of players questioning the play calling or being upset with the direction of the offense or decisions being made, right? So I think Eric's going to come in. I think players are really going to like him. He already, from what I've already seen him in press conferences, seems very confident. I mean, who isn't in a position like this? You kind of have to come off across as confident, but I really like it. I'm super excited to see, what he has to bring to the table. And Rivera sure as hell is too. I mean, this is a win now year for Rivera. So obviously he felt like he needed to bring in someone who could really make a difference.
Absolutely great points there, Chris, and I can't agree with you more. I mean, the consistency note is certainly something that we have looked for in the past, and I think it's been a gripe for all the Commanders fans out there that we haven't found that sort of consistency. I mean, there's the joke that, we're a 500 team and we somehow figured to do that with an odd number of games this year. And I think that,
True.
yeah, honestly, I mean, the only thing that we need is a little bit more consistency to break that 500 streak, and I think that he's a good addition, at least, towards doing that. Now, obviously, one of the things that we do have to talk about is these recent additions to the team that Bieniemy will be working with. And certainly, I mean, the biggest one to me so far has been the signing of QB Jacoby Brissett. His first year on the team, he has a 1 year deal worth $8 million. A veteran guy came out of the Patriots system. Patriots fans will remember him from when Tom Brady was suspended at the beginning of the year. He stepped in and was part of that undefeated run of quarterbacks without Tom Brady being on the team for the Patriots. He's kind of bounced around a bit. Went to the Colts for a year or two. Went to the Browns last year. He did not play in the game against us. That was just Deshaun Watson's first game back, I believe. First game back, possibly
Yep.
second.
He played his first game against the Texans.
Oh, really?
Yeah,
Okay.
correct. Yeah, he did play against the Texans, but he's a guy that and I sent you guys the numbers. He kind of looks like Taylor Heineke, but just with a little bit more, a little bit more veteran bristle on him. He's a guy that is somewhat considered a bridge quarterback, I'd say. I mean, the my thought when I saw this was, listen, we're gonna be drafting QB next year, first round, if we don't like Howell and if Jacoby Brissett steps into that role. And an interesting signing overall. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on him or maybe some of the other signings.
I mean, I think he's one of the higher tier backups. The guy has been around and he's stepped in. It seems everywhere that this guy has gone, like he's been forced into play. And knowing our franchise, we're gonna see this guy at some point this next season, unless Sam Howell can somehow break the curse and prove everybody wrong. So you know what you're getting with him. He's not gonna blow your socks off with his skill or ability or anything like that. But I think he's one of the better backup kind of insurance policy options that we could have gotten. Now, is it very exciting as a fan? No. I mean, when you have off season of trade rumors and big names moving around, you never want to see that the big move your team made was signing a career backup. So at the end of the day, I seems like a good dude, and I'm happy to have him on my team. But it doesn't instill a lot of confidence in this next season going forward, at least for me. Because I'm not sure what kind of ceiling we're given with him if he ends up being the starting quarterback.
Yeah, I like the signing. I like Brissett. I watched several games of his last year when he was the starter for the Browns in Deshaun Watson's absence, and I thought overall he looked pretty good. And I thought he's looked overall above average when in games that I have seen him. Obviously, he's been around, bounced around the league a little bit. But think about our QB room, right? Carson Wentz, obviously no longer here. We might touch on that a bit later, but Heineke, obviously in Atlanta now, and we did not come to a deal with him to re-sign him as much as I might have wished we had done that. Obviously, Sam Howell kind of already been named by Rivera tentatively as the incumbent starter heading into training camp, and very curious to see what he brings to the table, this offseason and in the preseason. And then Jake Fromm, was our practice squad quarterback last season, and he's still on the roster as well, and likely will, we wouldn't be surprised to see him again on the practice squad. I do think that we likely add another quarterback to this roster through the draft this year, likely in the later rounds. However, overall, yeah, Jacoby, like I said, I'm pleased with the signing. I think it makes sense. Rivera didn't want to go out and spend a bunch of money on a guy. I think Jacoby is a very affordable, high upside backup for us, and ideally would like him to stay in that backup role. I know, Clark, you mentioned this guy always seems to get pressed into a starting QB, role, maybe midway through the season or whatnot, and it wouldn't be the end of us by any means. I think he could keep us afloat just as well as most of the other backups in the league. But I like it. It didn't knock my socks off, though, so to speak.
And I guess this is a question for you guys, and it's a quick yes or no answer. But do you believe that this Jacoby Brissett signing is kind of us saying to Hal, like, listen, you're getting a shot, but you're not going to have an entire season?
Yeah, I mean, something along those lines. I think that I think that this signing does say that we want that insurance policy in case things don't pan out, which, and again, though, your ceiling with Sam Howell is as a team is as far as well as he plays. With Jacoby Brissett under the with Jacoby Brissett at the helm, I don't know how much we improve on last season. You got to remember the division isn't getting any easier. Everybody in our division it looks primed to be pretty good for the foreseeable future. So this move tells me that they are going to try to run with Hal. They like what they see with Hal, but if things don't work out, we're going to be right back where we have been for the last several years. And that's floating around 500 towards the bottom of the division.
Yeah, agreed. I think it's basically saying to Hal, this is your job to lose. But we have a guy that we're confident can go in and get it done. And can keep things afloat if you start to struggle.
Yeah, and I agree with you guys. I mean, I personally, me and Clark specifically, sorry to exclude you here, Chris, but we did see the first start for Sam Howell in the NFL, and it was extremely impressive. I mean, beating a Dallas Cowboys team that was playing all their starters on defense and having a game where it didn't even seem that close by the end of it, honestly. It was inspiring to see, but obviously, when you have a young guy like that who has only played one game as a starter, and you're kind of saying that you're committing to him, it's important to have that insurance policy, like Clark said, and Jacoby Brissett, so that if you do start heading in a negative direction, you can kind of curb the momentum a little bit by bringing in that backup and maybe even trying to change things around with him even. So yeah, just an interesting signing overall. I think it's definitely something with a lot of context to it and a lot of intrigue, especially when you're talking about the next year. Going down the list of the rest of these guys, we signed two offensive linemen and Andrew Wiley and Nick Gates. Both sort of veteran guys, one coming from in the division from the Giants with Nick Gates, one coming from the Chiefs with Andrew Wiley, both getting 3-year deals. And this kind of seems to me like the Wes Schweitzer and Morgan Moses replacements. I was wondering if you guys had any thoughts on these guys. I mean, they seem like the biggest signings to me outside of the Cody Barton signing. And I certainly think it's a positive step for us on the offensive line.
Definitely a positive step for us, Tom. That was one of our glaring weak points all last season long, was just the offensive line, the lack of consistency, and how we were kind of plugging in guys in positions they weren't comfortable in. And just it was quite frankly a mess. And I hope it gets better. We did, one side note, we did release John Matsko, who was our offensive line coach for many, many years. So I'm not sure if a replacement has been named at this time yet. But regardless, Wiley coming with Bieniemy rather from this the Chiefs. I've heard great things about him. I think he'll be our right tackle going into the season, and they'll therefore slide Cosme probably inside to right guard. Nick Gates, I've seen him play many games over the years. I know he's a little injury ridden as of late, but I think there's a good chance he's your starting center week 1, and that we see Chase Roullier either get cut or restructured later this offseason. And no knock on Roullier. I've really liked him, when he's played for us. He's just had 2 back-to-back seasons with very serious injuries that have completely wiped him out. So curious to see what happens there. But yes, much needed help to the O-line. The guys that Rivera brought in last year, the 2 guards, Norwell and Trey Turner, they really did not live up to expectations. However low those expectations were, they didn't live up to them. So I'm really pleased with these signings. I hope to see more depth signings for the offensive line, as well as, through the draft. We need to keep bolstering that unit, especially with the uncertainty at quarterback.
I think they will go to the draft to help bolster the rest of this offensive line, because I don't think that it's a unit that's necessarily complete. Andrew Wiley, like you said, great name recognition, brand recognition coming from the Chiefs. Bieniemy, you'd like to see him bringing in his guys. Wiley, of course, the Chiefs in that Super Bowl, one of the greatest offensive line performances ever in a big game. They didn't allow a single sack in the Super Bowl against that Eagles defensive line that was historically one of the best there has been in terms of getting sacks. So that is certainly great to see. He's coming off of one of the biggest games of his life. This guy wasn't the centerpiece necessarily of that offensive line. They've got Creed Humphrey, an all-pro center, and I believe they have some other guys on the left side that were pretty strong. But nonetheless, I'd like to think that those signings will help shore up a group that, in my opinion, was possibly our biggest area of need headed into this offseason.
Yeah, and just the one quick note there that I forgot to mention at the top, but they have been planning on moving Samuel Cosme inside after having kind of a rough year on the outside. And we've seen a lot of success with moving tackles to guards. Look at Eric Flowers, who we ended up signing after some really rough years with the New York Giants, and he ended up becoming, somewhat of a Pro Bowl mention guard after his years with us. So I think that this is a really positive note to bring Andrew Wiley onto the team and being able to kind of have a little bit of flexibility with Samuel Cosme, a guy that we kind of wanted to play for quite a while on this team. So yeah, all in all, a positive step for the team. Now just going down the list of some of the newer faces, Marcus Kemp being signed. He came from Kansas City. Cody Barton, who is a new linebacker. I know that we are all excited to see some fresh faces in that linebacker room, especially considering a player that we will mention later leaving the linebacker room. Anthony Nelson, also linebacker, being added to the team, and Abdullah Anderson, a defensive tackle out of the Atlanta Falcons, a guy that we all were kind of a little bit surprised got signed by us. To my best understanding, was kind of a playmaker for that Atlanta Falcons team. All very interesting signings. I think that those are really solid, especially for the team needs that we have. Cody Barton especially was a guy that I definitely thought was sort of a lifer on that Seahawks team. He was a really solid guy, kind of reminds me of like a young Cole Holcomb, where he was kind of making a bunch of plays, but wasn't really getting necessarily mentioned as one of those guys who was important on the defense. And now he'll be asked to step into a role that, maybe he earns a starting spot and we see him next to Jamin Davis next year.
Yeah, as long as we don't have David Mayo slotted for the starting role alongside Jamin, I think we'll be in good shape, or at least better shape. I like the Barton signing. I don't know too much about him, but in my initial research on the guy, I think he could be a good piece for us and potentially, have a ceiling higher than he's shown already. And then Abdullah Anderson, another guy I don't know too much about before, our signing of him, but I like it. It's thinking, ahead, and it's thinking in the now as well, right? You got Allen and Payne. I'm sure we'll talk about Payne here in a sec, but we have both of those guys obviously at the D tackle position. Amazing players, Pro Bowl caliber players, both Pro Bowlers last year. But behind them, it's really a question mark. And in years past, we've had strong guys like Tim Settle or Matt Ioannidis, backing up those guys. So we'd really not skip a beat when it came time for rotational switches, in game. Right now, it's pretty much just Fedarian Mathis, who was a second-round pick for us last year, had a lot of high hopes for. However, he had a season-ending injury, I believe, in the first or second game. So he was a non-factor all season long, and then caused us to kind of really rely on rookie fifth-rounder John Ridgeway a lot last season, who I thought looked pretty good at times and then absolutely abysmal at others. So I think they're looking to, hey, we need more guys that can kind of spell some of our top defensive tackle playmakers in Allen and Payne, and guys that can come in and still play at a high level and be able to make plays for us. So overall, I like the additions that we've made to the team so far this offseason. I don't think we're done. However, I don't think there's going to be any. I would be surprised if we saw any major, large, big money signings happen. I think Rivera's really focused on getting value for play out of players at reasonable deals. Maybe taking care of our own, right, of our own players and signing them to big extensions has been clearly more the focus, rather than going out and grabbing a big Carson Wentz type signing or something like that.
And I think that these signings also would lead me to believe that a lot of our depth is going to be through guys they target in the draft. Because a lot of the guys that we've signed outside of maybe Wiley and Brissett, a lot of these other guys, you don't really know what you have with them, because Nick Gates, he was a guy that started some games for the Giants, but he's coming off of a year, right, possibly even more. I believe he had kind of an interesting injury history.
Might even be like a year and a half to 2-year injury.
So he there's some question marks with him as to what kind of player we're going to get out of him. And then all these other guys, again, not names that were necessarily jumping off the board on your top 100 hottest free agents list. But like you said, bringing in these guys on with good value, and you're not asking, say, an Abdullah Anderson to come in and be a huge difference maker. So I think that we might also see some of our other holes filled by the draft, because when you look at some spots in the secondary and still filling out the rest of this offensive line, and still even at linebacker, there's questions across the board. So like you said, I don't think they're done yet, but I think it tells me that they might have some guys they're going to be looking to take in the draft.
Absolutely. And moving on and talking about some of the old faces which we have brought back to the team, we re-signed David Mayo, obviously a contentious player on this podcast, and Jonathan Williams to 1 year contracts. We also bring back Danny Johnson, a cornerback on a 2 year extension, a really interesting player, especially considering how we drafted in the secondary these past years. We signed Tyler Larson as well, offensive line signing, which is really big for us in terms of depth pieces. Brought back F.A. Obata, a podcast favorite of me and my hosts here. Kaliki Hudson coming back, tendering Jeremy Reeves, Pro Bowl selection
Jeremy
Reeves, might I add.
First
Milo
team All
Eifert,
Pro Jeremy Reeves.
indeed he was. Milo Eifler and Rashad Wildgoose as well coming back on 1 year extensions. And obviously the biggest returning face, a man who received the franchise tag and then a subsequent 4 year, I believe, $80 million extension in Duran Payne. Now, looking at these guys that we brought back, are you guys overall more happy, more disappointed, or somewhere in the middle? I mean, obviously, the players that we lost, there's a few names that we'll get to that are certainly disappointing to see, and others that we might actually be happy to see gone. So, where do you guys fall on these re-signings? Are you happy, sad, etc.?
I would say I'm happy at some. I'm not necessarily sad at any of these other signings. I also think that a lot of these players are players that are not going to be week one roster guys. I mean, you just look at these guys like Khalid Hudson. He's a guy that had been in the building for a few years. He wasn't a week. He got cut for the start of the season. Was kind of a practice squad on and off the team guy. Danny Johnson, same thing. He's kind of been around for a little bit. Interesting to see him get a 2 year extension though. I guess they maybe liked what they saw, some extra development out of him. But the guys that are, I would say Tyler Larson, F.A. Obata are going to be two of the guys that you're going to for sure have on this opening roster. F.A. Obata, we'd love to talk about him, but not only is he a cool story, foreign player, but I think he solidified himself as a solid NFL player this year. He played well in some spots. Of course, large portion of that season we were without one of our starting ends, so it was kind of him and James Smith-Williams by committee. And I don't think that he, I think that F.A. Obata proved himself a contract. But yeah, I mean, like David May, I could see David Mayo. We all maybe groaned to see David Mayo back. I don't know that it's a guarantee that guy makes the roster. Same for Jonathan Williams.
Yeah, I feel good. Great points, Clark. And overall, I feel good about these signings. None of them are knocking my socks off. Obviously, Duran Payne 4 year extension, I'm hyped about. I know we all thought we were very uncertain, that we were going to be able to get him back or not. And I'm very pleased that we were able to get that done. I think that really solidifies this line, and particularly the interior, as a spot of strength that we can continue to rely on, this season and in years to follow. I do like the F.A. Obata. You called that out, Clark. I think he had a couple nice sacks, and he's a good rotational guy for us. Tyler Larson, I take it or leave it. He's been injury prone, and I guess we do just need center depth that is familiar with our system. So, although that system is definitely going to change some, I guess I'm okay with it. Danny Johnson, he had a couple highlights, bright spots last season. I think they like what they saw. He had a pick or two, I believe. So, and I like the guy. So glad to see him getting the extension. Jonathan Williams, I think, is actually, I honestly would not be surprised if he's your number 3 guy at the running back position this year. He was for much of this year, as J.D. McKissick was hurt for much of the year, and the staff seemed to seem what they like with Williams over Patterson. So I actually think and I think he did well, overall in the opportunities he was given. So I like that. I think you will see him on the roster unless we go ahead and draft another running back, which also wouldn't surprise me with Bieniemy in the building now. I was surprised to see Jeremy Reeves tendered, and only for 1 year, which essentially allows other teams to give him offers right? And then we have an offer of, first right to counter that offer before he can accept another team's offer. So I actually haven't heard if that's been finalized or not yet. But considering the Pro Bowl bid and just obviously he's well loved by this team, and kind of a key, a core special teamer and a key, kind of player in this building, so to speak. I was hoping to see him get a larger extension than that, but I definitely think that's a guy you'll see on this roster again as well. Rashad Wildgoose and Milo Eifler, who knows? Maybe they're practice squatters, maybe they're on the roster. I'm not sure, but overall, I like it. Probably not the end of guys you see, on this list either.
Yeah, I kind of really agree with you guys. And I think obviously Deron Payne was, as you guys mentioned earlier, kind of a worry for us. I honestly had sort of predicted, I put on my Nostradamus cap here, that if we lost him, that we might even go after a guy like Brian Bresee in this year's draft, a local kid. He had gone to Damascus High School. I had actually played rec basketball against him and put up some points, and that was going
People
to be my
forget that.
fun. People do not talk about the Tom rec basketball game against Brian Bresee, where I put up points and got boards, mind you, against the 6'5", 300-pound 17-year-old. Now, that being said, having Deron Payne back, huge. And it's great to have him right next to Jonathan Allen. Two guys who, when they talk about this defensive line outside of Chase Young, when he comes back this year at full strength and kind of gives us another full year of production, hopefully, is one of those guys that's a core member of that defensive line and is almost like, the reverse hogs in some ways. I mean, might even start calling them the Boars just because they really are, these gigantic guys that are going after the quarterback and are very nimble, great players. I think Deron Payne's a great add to have back. I'm happy that we have him locked down for 4 years. As for the other guys, F.A. Obata definitely made some plays. Great to see him back. Tyler Larson, great depth piece, as we said. Kaliki Hudson, I actually wouldn't be surprised to see him still on the team. A young guy who was a good linebacker and a great depth piece for us. Now, obviously, saying good linebacker on this team is like saying he's the most yellow golden retriever. I mean, it's not that special. But still, guys like David Mayo, Jonathan Williams. I hope Jonathan Williams is actually a guy that we don't see on this roster because I'd love to see us move on to maybe a younger guy, possibly bring back a guy like Jarrett Patterson, who's sadly still unsigned. A guy who I thought was honestly a little bit of a better runner in our system, but still good to see him back on the team. Rashad Wildgoose, great depth piece at cornerback, definitely had some plays last year. Definitely had a few plays missed last year as well. Jeremy Reeves, I don't think you see him tendered if we did not have such a great year out of Derek Forrest. And I think Jeremy Reeves is just suffering from a deep safety room in terms of the guys that can get on the field and the guys who are going to need contracts in a few years. But Jeremy Reeves, obviously a guy that had a breakout year of sorts, and I think this is their prove to us that we need you year for him. And yeah, overall great signings along the way. Can't wait to see what they do. Can't wait to see who's still on the roster at the beginning of the season.
So let me ask you guys something here. Obviously, Deron Payne getting signed, first the franchise tag, but then the 4-year extension. We're all very happy to see those guys play real well together up front. But Deron Payne, he's now making more than any defensive tackle in the NFL outside of Aaron Donald. So that's a lot of money. And, we've seen a couple of our other key guys like Allen and like Terry McLaurin receive these long-term contracts. Coming up here, we're going to have a couple of guys that are going to need to be re-signed, the likes of Montez Sweat, Chase Young, and Cam Curl on this defense, guys who have been staples of our defense for the last couple of years. And there's only so much money that can go around. And I'm not sure that we're going to be able to get all of those guys to the deals that they're all going to be asking for. So I guess what I would pose to you guys is, what do you see happening there? What do you guys think that this team should do, or are we kind of waiting to see what's going to happen with some of these players?
It's a very valid question because not only do you have the guys you mentioned, but also throw names like Kendall Fuller into the mix and Curtis Samuel. Those are both guys who I believe are on the last deals of their respective contracts as well this year. So there's a lot of names out there of guys that are key contributors to this team, and playmakers, quite frankly, to this team, and leaders on this roster that lead their respective positional groups that we need to have back. And it's going to be tough. I put my faith in Mayhew and Rivera to crunch the numbers here a little bit and figure out a way to keep the guys that are kind of the core of this team and guys that we continue to build around. It'll be tough to keep them all. I think a lot of that decision making will be based off of how these guys play this year. That's a whole nother conversation and really in and of itself that we can get into, maybe at another time. But I think there's a lot of guys on this team that are basically playing, not really to prove themselves as a capable football player, but playing to prove themselves as worthy of, hey, this team is only going to have so many dollars to throw at extensions. We've already got some under our belt. Who's left? Who's the next biggest priority for us to get signed to a long-term deal? And if you're not that priority, maybe you're the odd man or two looking out from the inside.
I completely agree with you there, Chris. I mean, from the names that we listed, just being quite honest, and I think I've said this to you guys in private conversation, I wouldn't be mad to see Montez Sweat lost if it meant keeping a guy like Chase Young. I mean, Montez has played well over the years. He hasn't ever really fulfilled that first rounder to me, that first round designation to me at all. He's had his years here and there. I personally think that if we lose him, it's not that big of a loss. We can find some better outside guys in the draft, honestly, in the upcoming years. Chase Young has to be one of those guys that you give a big contract, though. I mean, you take him with the second overall pick, and that's something that is certainly, he may have not fulfilled the second overall pick completely yet, but that first year was absolutely electric. This past year, he was dealing with injuries. We need to see another sort of solid year out of him. Cam Curl is a guy that sadly has kind of become somewhat expendable, especially with the way that Defoe played. Now losing Bobby McCain in free agency this year to Philadelphia, that kind of upped his value back again with us and kind of frees up a little bit of cash to throw his way. But I don't think Cam Curl is one of those guys getting a big money contract this year. I do hope that we get him long term, being that he is a young guy and has kind of proved himself to be at least worthwhile to keep, if not a guy that is kind of like a solid, not foundational piece per se, but one of those guys that kind of is known to the fans very well as a playmaker. You make a great point with Curtis Samuel there needing to be signed. Now, I do think the fact that he was injured for so long and that we didn't really get to see him play a lot of games until this year hurts him in negotiations. But he's a guy that certainly we should, in all likelihood, keep as an extra tool in the belt. I think one interesting point to make here is that we might have even been talking about Gibby in terms of extensions following this year. I mean, Antonio Gibson played this sort of valuable jackknife role. We saw his role decrease this year, especially with a guy like B-Rob in the building who really, the fans got behind, and obviously he had his sort of he had his issue with the gunshot wound. And that was, the talking point for the entire league. And he came back and played really well, even started the big hat craze, which I think will be one of my favorite memories from this past year. So, you have a lot of guys that are kind of their value is going up and down, kind of like a slinky almost, where it'll rebound at some point. But right now, I certainly see a bunch of guys who we can sort of underpay, I guess would be the best way to put it. And Chase Young is an absolute must sign in my mind.
What do you say to this? Let's say a new ownership comes in and these individuals or individual maybe has more guaranteed money they're willing to throw around. Does that impact any of these signings, or does that actually does a new ownership lend to more of a cleaning of house? I guess a lot of this would depend on what happens this season.
I think it's a double-edged sword. I think that you do see a cleaning of house a bit with new ownership. Like I think you get rid of some of these like middle of the line guys like Kaliki Hudson and these sort of long-term guys, and you start seeing some more money thrown at bigger names or at least names that are newer and maybe have better stats. But at the same time, I think when you see these draft picks, especially like these guys who have spent their career with the team, however long or short that career may be, I think you definitely see them getting good contracts if they're good players. So I think it's a bit of a double-edged sword. I think you lose some players that you like, and you keep some of the players who are commanders through and through.
Yeah, we'll just kind of have to see where the dominoes lie really at the end of the season. Guys like Curtis Samuel, that's going to depend on how well he plays this year, how big of an impact he has for us this year in a crowded, wide receiver room. I feel actually differently about the Montez Sweat versus Chase Young, kind of decision if there was one to be made. We don't have to get too into the weeds with that now. But yeah, I think these guys that we're looking at, you mentioned Cam Curl, I think a lot of that is going to depend on the play this year, not only of what we get out of them, but what we get out of players around them. And again, the draft could change all, this as well. So we'll really just kind of have to keep touching on that and discussing it as more and more, unravels before us. But would like to briefly touch on some of the guys we lost. This is a couple of these names here really do sting a little bit. A couple of fan and a couple podcast favorites here as well. So obviously have to firstly mention Cam Sims. We lost quite arguably the best receiver that we've had
of all time.
The longest tenured receiver actually by facts that we've had on this team. I guess to date, up until now.
I mean, outside of Tress Way, was he the longest tenured player?
Good question.
Possibly, with Morgan Moses being gone.
He's a holdover from Gruden.
Right. Maybe Chase Rie I could see being being up there. But definitely, I know he was with us since 2018, I believe. So
yeah,
happy for the guy. I'm disappointed we didn't bring him back. But he saw like a diminished role this last season. Obviously, we have a deeper wide receiver room than we've ever had. So it makes sense for him to go out and get on a team that, he might have a little more playing time than, although the Raiders are pretty deep at receiver. So he might be playing a similar role there than he played with us.
I mean, who wouldn't want to go play in Las Vegas if you're Cam Sims? I mean, it's a very favorable destination for free agents, and I mean, I don't know. They did just get rid of one of their top targets in Waller, who I'm sure we will discuss later because of the team that he went to. But Cam Sims, I mean, we've said it time and time again. Fan base loved this dude. It is sad to see him gone. He gave us some very memorable moments, namely his one-handed catch against that Steelers team in that 2020 season, first year with Ron Rivera. They were an undefeated team. It was a third down, big play, and Cam Sims kind of put the team on his back there. Mm-hmm. So, and of course, his very memorable mossing and baptism of Trayvon Diggs a season ago. So Cam Sims leaving fans with a lot of good things to remember, and certainly going to keep my tabs on him for the rest of his career and wish him nothing but the best.
Very sad to see him go. Indeed, he also had 100 yards in that playoff game versus the Bucs, so kind of left his mark, on the NFL postseason.
Yeah, I mean, he's just like a clutch time performer, and your big time players, you pay those guys to show up in the big games for you, and clearly Vegas knew what they were doing by bringing in a guy like Cam Sims.
Agreed.
Yeah, I think it's interesting, especially considering that you have a guy like Devontae there, and I think it's weird to think that and Hunter Renfrow, and it's weird to think that both of those guys are going to be the 2 and 3 receivers in terms of skill when Cam Sims goes to that team, and I think that's something new for Devontae Adams to not be the top guy somewhere.
Yeah.
I think Jimmy G. I think Jimmy G certainly is going to have every tool at his disposal to be successful at that Raiders team. And Cam Sims really is kind of, he's an A+ signing for whoever he goes to. I mean, A++ if you're asking me. And just a really sad guy to see go. And I think that also that same sort of moniker of being a really sad signing to see go is Cole Holcomb going to Pittsburgh. And I gotta say, this might be the most Pittsburgh signing of all Pittsburgh signings. I mean, a guy who I undervalued in terms of the talk around the league about him. This past year, he was kind of known as like our guy, our defensive solid piece, our do everything sort of Swiss Army knife defensive guy. And to go to Pittsburgh, I mean, good on him. He's going to be with a great coaching staff. He's going to go over 500, as we all know Tomlin's record for not being below 500. And great signing for Pittsburgh. Absolutely A+. You move on from a guy like Devin Bush to get him. Sad to see him go, even though we may have had some critical words at times in the past.
I mean, he was the best linebacker we had. I think I like what I saw from Jamin Davis this year. It was really encouraging to see the improvement from his rookie year. But now kind of the weight of that linebacking room is falling on his shoulders now in year 3 with Cole Holcomb gone. I do think it's a solid signing for them. By no means is he I don't think he's a solid player. I don't think he has the potential to be like a Pro Bowl level guy, but on a defense that already has those big names like Minkah Fitzpatrick and TJ Watt, I think he's a great complement in the middle of that defense for Pittsburgh. That's a good young team coming up over there in the AFC North. So sad to see him go, but clearly we signed a couple of linebackers and they're still the draft at large. So the linebacking unit is one that is a position group that I think they are trying to address here before the end of the offseason.
Absolutely. And moving on just to some of the other players, a guy that is going to be probably the most polarizing part of our discussions today. Taylor Heineke signing to the Atlanta Falcons. Hopefully, and if they're smart, he will be the backup to Desmond Ridder on that team. A guy who, let's be honest, I have no positive words to say about him other than the fact that he helped us to a few wins. He statistically was not that great of a quarterback. I'm happy to see him go to a team that certainly needs, slightly better quarterbacking, but I honestly don't think that he's an improvement in any way to that team. Great to see Old Dominion University still having a player in the league. Whether he deserves it or not, that's a question for other people to ask. Funny to see him go to the Falcons, though, because when I think of the past few times we played the Falcons, it has been Taylor Heineke kind of winning those games against the Falcons. So almost like the team signing their boogeyman to kind of get rid of that moniker on him of being the boogeyman for them. Overall, not a great signing to me by Atlanta. Not necessarily something they needed by any means. Definitely going to be a career backup there. Hopefully not going to see him start. If they do, then that team is just doomed for the next year or two. But I'm curious to hear what you guys got to say about this. Not too sad to see him go.
Yeah, let's put this Heineke slander on pause here. He's had his ups and downs here, and I know this has been something we've talked about a lot on episodes past. I love the guy, and I'm really appreciative of the good memories and experiences and moments that he did bring this fan base during a period of time when oftentimes there wasn't much else to cheer about. And obviously was a guy that a lot of the fan base, not everyone, but could get behind and kind of identify with. And I wish him nothing but the best. We'll see how the rest of his career plays out. I'm glad he got a nice paycheck, out of it, which is great to see. Would love, in a different world, would love to have Taylor Heineke, sticking around in Washington, and who knows what could have been, if Rivera had kept him in, towards the end of last season instead of putting Carson Wentz back in, whatever, is what it is. I'm appreciative of Taylor Heineke. I love the guy. I love his attitude. I love his energy. Love who he is. Love what he brought to the team. Clearly, the players on the team rallied around him and really enjoyed his presence in the locker room and on the field. So yeah, sad to see him go. But obviously he's not perfect, and we're looking to get closer to that. So gotta. It's a business, so things move on.
Yeah, I mean, this guy gave us everything he had. There was no denying his passion or his will to win. He had a really good Players Tribune article come out today that he spoke about kind of his journey and
Cool.
and his his journey back into the NFL, and then kind of a connection that he found with our fan base, and talked about how he really resonated with them and they with him. And he admitted in this article, I throw some interceptions. I'm not the best player, but I hope that you all could recognize that I was always trying my hardest and was leaving it all on the field for you guys, because with him, you never knew if it was going to be his last game, and he played that way every single time. And I'm really happy to see him land in Atlanta. He's from Georgia. So, and I believe they gave him a couple-year contract. So
2 year, 20 mil.
Yeah, that's a pretty good chunk of change for a guy who, when he got back into the league, he was studying for grad school finals. So, guy that 3 years ago was sitting on his couch is now just signed a 2-year extension for 20 mil, and he gets to play in his home state of Georgia. I couldn't be more happy for him, especially after the way that he was kind of disrespected, in my opinion, by this organization in a number of ways.
Absolutely. I mean, in all honesty, I will miss some of the better highlights of his career with us. And I'll give him his flowers. He certainly wasn't the worst option we had at quarterback that I've seen. And he was a guy that I did, in some part of my body, I have to admit that he was a guy that I did want to see stick to the team, maybe if the contract wasn't too hard. But I mean, 2 years, 20 million is certainly more than I think we were ever going to offer him. And I'm happy to see him get paid. Not happy to see him stay in the NFC. I did not want to see him in our division, or not in our conference, pardon me. But good on him for getting that payday, and I will be sad to not see him in some part of my body. I have to admit that. Moving on, the other recently
Proud
lost
of you,
players.
Tom. Proud of you.
Yeah, that's a lot of growth out of you to be able to admit that.
Exactly. That is growth by me, and it's almost hard to admit, but I'm kind of like the Grinch. My heart is going about 3 sizes currently. Now just getting to the rest of the guys. I mean, we lost Bobby McCain, a guy who I once shouted at outside of Commanders Stadium.
Twice,
not
man.
not in a exactly, not in a negative way at all, purely to get his attention, and he gave me a little peace sign to kind of roll down the window. Really awesome guy going to Philadelphia. Sad to see him stay in the division, because he is a guy that, great veteran, absolutely made plays for us at times. But happy to see him kind of, continue his career somewhere else and not necessarily be lost to the business aspect. Wes Schweitzer to the Jets. That is a big signing for him. I think he certainly has gotten to a team where there's going to be a lot of question marks, and he's going to be working with a guy like Aaron Rodgers potentially, who recently said that he plans on being with the Jets this next year. And I think they found a perfect signing on the offensive line in terms of a guy who has been around the league and will be able to kind of help them out in some sort of way. Sad to see him go as well, but we've also sort of had our downs with him as well. So weird feeling. Then we did cut J.D. McKissick this offseason, a guy who we all kind of felt a little bit bad for, honestly, considering the contract offers he had gotten last free agency, and to see him cut, you know, I always think of J.D. McKissick's game against the Falcons, where he honestly won us that game. Um, and it's just sad to see him go, but obviously it's a business, and maybe this is opening up room for new guys. So, what do you guys have to say about Bob McKay and Wes Schweitzer or J.D. McKissick? Guys that we recently lost.
Yeah, sad to see Bobby go. I thought he was a solid player for us, but the writing was on the wall. He was going to be, if he stuck around on this team, he was likely going to be depth with the emergence of Derek Forrest and obviously Cam Curl opposite him. I know we do tend to see a lot of 3 safety sets out of this defense, so maybe there was some room for him there, but I think the coaching staff just felt it was time to move on. Wishing him the best of luck. Wes Schweitzer, a guy I always liked. He's really got that positional versatility, which a lot of coaches like. I know that was heavily favored, during his time here on the Commanders. Happy to see him latch on. He struggled a little bit last season when he had stronger seasons in the past for us. So happy to see him latch on. And then, yes, very, very sad to see McKissick get cut, but it makes sense. It is a business. His injuries have unfortunately derailed his career, and I hope it's not the end of the line for him.
Yeah, certainly J.D. McKissick. It's a sad ending to see. He could have gone to Buffalo last year, but decided to come back, and it's very sad to see the way that things turned out with him. Bobby McCain to Philadelphia. I think that's kind of an underrated signing for them. Because they have really been gutted this offseason. I mean, people might not realize it, but because they've been able to keep some of their bigger names, which again we can get to later when we talk about the rest of the division. But I mean, they have lost the majority of their starting defense that took them to a Super Bowl this year. And Bobby McCain is a guy that I think will fit in nicely for them, and we'll get to see him 2 times a year. So, and again, knowing us, wouldn't be surprised if he ends up being a real solid player for them, just because naturally that would be the thing to happen to our franchise.
Yeah, fair enough. Now, moving on, talking about some unsigned guys who were on our team last year but have not been given a contract yet. Carson Wentz, a guy who I think we can all agree we might have seen the last of in the NFL. He may get a backup contract or some sort of offer from somewhere that's really quarterback needy at some point. However, unlikely unless that really is, an injury thing. Trey Turner, a guy who we added last year, kind of a big signing almost in some ways, a Commando retread. According to our podcast, definitely had a weak year. Certainly some positive to talk about when you talk about Trey Turner, but one of those guys who I'm not necessarily sad not to see back. A guy that I am sad not to see back, Jarrett Patterson, a guy who we talked about in the early sort of part of the season as being a guy that we hoped made the roster, ended up getting practice squad designated. He was the high school teammate of Chase Young. Sad to see that he is currently unsigned. However, I wouldn't be surprised to see him brought back on the team at some point during the season if he is still available. Another guy I wouldn't be surprised to see brought back, especially if we have linebacker injuries, simply because it's just become a running joke at this point.
Don't say it. Don't say it.
Is sadly John Bostic, unsigned, most likely going to be on this team if we see a slew of linebacking injuries. Definitely not going to be seeing him on any other team, most likely. And finally, to round out that list, Nick Martin, a guy whose brother, Zach Martin, is a all-pro, sort of best at his position kind of guy for the Cowboys. He is still not signed. I would actually be unsurprised if he stayed unsigned.
Looking at these names of the unsigned free agents from our team, I mean, Trey Turner, of course, that was a bit of a disappointment. He's a guy that has Pro Bowl level. He's been in the Pro Bowl, been a high level player, but he's just out of his prime. Obviously, Carson Wentz is the biggest story. Is the biggest story of the offseason last year, and it's the biggest story come to the end of this season with how things played out. I just think that it was refreshing to see them fully admit this mistake. It's disappointing that it even took place in the first place. The fact that we brought him in and the fact that it went public, how Rivera was like, I was the guy that blah, 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 blah. So the fact that they just straight up cut him, probably a pretty humbling experience for Carson Wentz, if he hasn't already had that in the NFL. And I don't know. I just liked the fact that they were so swift with it, and it wasn't even a question as to whether or not this guy was going to be on the roster again. It saved us a heck of a lot of money. And in a way, after just a 1-year trial, I was just very happy to see them actually go through with this, because I don't know about you guys. There's some part of me that thought that something was going to be, that there's a lot of money on the books for him, and the risk and the commitment they made to him, made me kind of question what was going to happen there. But it was very refreshing to see them admit to their mistake and get rid of him this offseason.
Absolutely, and you said a refreshing change of pace. Obviously, these things for us turn out to be sort of dragged through the mud things, and it's nice to see this sort of almost clean beheading of just Carson Wentz getting off the team, and it was pretty cut and clear. And moving on, I think that it will be positive for both us and him to move on to different situations, especially considering that we were probably never going to give him another chance to start. We were never going to pay him the money that he was owed if we kept him. Just made a lot of sense on both sides, and I do hope that he can find some peace in that. Now moving on, we do sort of want to wash our hands of this team for a little bit. I think it's interesting just to talk about what's been happening in the NFC East. Once called the NFC Least, now I think we should call it the NFC Beast with the moves that are being made. Obviously, when you have a team from our division that goes to the Super Bowl, it has to be a strong division. And I think some moves really showed that. I mean, you see Darren Waller, maybe the biggest move of the offseason so far for our division, being traded to the Giants for a 4th-round pick, a guy who was discussed as maybe the number 3 tight end in the league, possibly number 2 to some people if you weren't that big of a Kittle fan. Going to the Giants, and this really punctuates what seems to be a real change of pace for the Giants, trying to get back to that sort of playoff team that they expect in a big market like that. I'm interested to see how it goes. I certainly think that Daniel Jones is the guy that has, these next 4 years are prove it years. He got some big money in the offseason that, a lot of people didn't necessarily feel was justified. And I think if he can't make it work with Darren Waller, it'll be an interesting conversation about how that team moves in the future. I don't know if you guys have any notes to add to that, but feel free.
Yeah. Sadly, I think that this is the perfect player that they could have brought in for Daniel Jones. Watching the guy play this year it was very strange, because we had known him to be just a guy that was loose with the football and would fumble or make a costly mistake, forcing throws. And really this year we saw one of the most conservative quarterbacks in the league. This guy was not they were not having him throw the ball down the field, but he was throwing very accurate passes with not a lot of risk, and they were running the ball well with their elite running back in Saquon. And so I think a guy like Darren Waller to be kind of a safety blanket for Daniel Jones and kind of the style of offense that they were running, I think this guy is going to have a case to lead their team in receptions, and that is if he can stay healthy. That's kind of been his problem over the last couple of years. He's been unable to stay healthy out there with the Raiders. So if he can stay healthy, I think it's going to be a solid addition for them, unfortunately.
Yeah, I agree. I think Dable really turned the Giants organization around last year and got clearly getting the most out of Daniel Jones. And I think, a guy like Darren Waller is exactly what he needs. And I think Dable will coach him up to likely be better than he's ever been, or as good as we've seen him be in seasons past. So definitely going to be a problem for us, which is why it's critical that we feel comfortable about the linebacker position going into this year.
Yeah, especially guys that can cover. The David Mayo re-signing, of course, does not lend to that kind of style of play. But yeah, I mean, Darren Waller, he's a mismatch nightmare.
Absolutely, and I think when you look at the NFC East, he's probably the biggest addition. But I think the second biggest news is the Cowboys releasing first-round pick long time ago, great running back for them for a few years, Ezekiel Elliott, a guy who it's kind of become the joke that running backs are kind of like Leonardo DiCaprio girlfriends. Once you get to 25, they kind of get rid of you. And this is a great, example of it, in my opinion. Ezekiel Elliott is a guy that was a Pro Bowl guy for many years, and that offensive line sort of had its changes, and obviously Ezekiel had his injury issues. And it's interesting to see them move on from him, and maybe it's just the contract, but I did not expect this at all. I thought that, it's kind of been the joke between us in private conversations, especially with our friend who is a Cowboys fan, that their best running back was Tony Pollard for these past few years. And now it's honestly true that their best running back is Tony Pollard. They obviously make a quick move to sign Ronald Jones II as a backup for Tony Pollard now, who I think is an interesting add, but certainly doesn't replace the value of Zeke at times. Unsure if you guys have anything to add on this, but I think it's certainly a really interesting move by an NFC East team.
I'm bummed. I wish they kept their fullback / extra O lineman on the team.
I mean, yeah, we can slander the guy all we want. He definitely got the best of us at some points throughout his career.
Oh, definitely, most definitely.
Yeah, I mean, towards the end there, it was just very clear that he wasn't the same player that he once was. I think that, and that's at fault of the organization, because they rode that guy to the ground for the better part of whatever 4-5 years, the beginning of his career. I mean, he just got rode into the ground, carry after carry for him, and he just, the running back can only take so many carries that early in your career on that heavy of a workload. I think that he'll land on his feet. I don't think that he's necessarily a bad player. I mean, I had him in fantasy this year, and he scores a lot of touchdowns. He's kind of like a goal line touchdown merchant, fantasy wise. So I think that he's gonna land on his feet. He's just not worth that contract at all. It was clear that they wanted to make some moves. I mean, they just traded for Brandon Cooks to try to be a number 2 receiver for them, which is an interesting move. Considering they got rid of Amari Cooper for only a 5th-round pick last year, which was a bit of a questionable move. But because I think Brandon Cooks is definitely a downgrade from Amari Cooper. But nonetheless, I think Zeke will sign somewhere. He's never going to be the player he once was early in his career in Dallas, but I think that he can contribute to a team.
I agree with a lot of those points, Clark. I think, one note, I think Brandon Cooks could actually be poised for a really solid year, just with a more solid offense around him, versus, obviously what he was dealing with in Houston. Ezekiel Elliott, I agree. He'll land on his feet. I don't think this is the end of the line for Zeke. But clearly, Cowboys are wanting to part ways. They feel good about Pollard. They'll probably add another piece or two to that backfield as well. So Zeke will land on his feet somewhere. It's just a matter of time before, maybe as we get closer to the season, teams will want to shore up their depth and put a veteran guy like Zeke in their backfield or amongst their backfield.
Yeah, and that's a great point. I think that you definitely will see him somewhere else. I think that it's important that they have an offensive line wherever he lands, though, so that he doesn't have to go through that sort of bodily destruction that he was on the Cowboys, especially with the amount of times they would run it with him in those early years. And finally, wrapping up the Around the NFC segment, obviously we talked about Philly getting Bobby McCain, But they did lose some important key pieces with Javon Hargrave, Miles Sanders, and Gardner Minshew all signing in different places. Obviously, did get some faces back, along with some interesting new faces with Jason Kelsey, arguably the best center in the league, deciding not to retire and return this next season, pardon me. Fletcher Cox signing a 1-year deal, one of the better defensive tackles in the league, to my opinion. James Bradbury, Marcus Mariota coming from the Falcons, a new face, which is a very interesting signing, although very similar to their current starting quarterback in Jalen Hurts in some ways and not in other ways. Signing Rashad Penny to essentially replace Miles Sanders. Rashad Penny, for those who are unaware, was a first-round late pick by the Seahawks, and I believe he was the first running back selected in that draft. And very interesting career overall, kind of a guy that didn't really live up to the, expectations, but, he's on a new team and he's getting a chance to show his true colors again on a team that's more successful. And finally signing Greedy Williams, a player out of LSU. Greedy is indeed not his real name for those of you who are unaware. However, that is his popular name to be called. Coming from the Browns and really looking like an interesting secondary piece. My main notes would basically just be that they didn't necessarily get better or worse by any means and really solidified a team that has a lot of its key pieces already in place. So just some interesting moves by the Eagles there. I'm not sure if you guys have anything to add, but feel free to make any comments now or forever hold your peace.
I would argue that this team got significantly worse. And it might not jump off the page at you because they kept guys like a Darius Slay and Kelsey coming back, but they lost
They
a
got rid of Slay.
significant. They did not get rid of Slay. They actually, it was reported they were going to, and then it was reported that they agreed to a new deal. So they did keep Slay in the building. But they did lose guys like CJ Gardner-Johnson, who they traded for in the middle of the season. That was a huge piece for them. They did lose other key defensive guys like TJ Edwards, Kaiser White, and Marcus Epps. But probably the biggest loss was Javon Hargrave, who went to the 49ers, which that is just going to be a disgusting defensive line now out west in San Francisco. But they really lost a fair amount of players, especially on the defensive side of the ball. I think they lost Sanders running back to free agency, but I think that they can kind of replicate his impact through signings and various other running backs they have. But I wouldn't brush over all these losses, and not to mention that we know that in the NFC East, nothing is guaranteed, and there hasn't been a repeat winner in this division since the early 2000s. So I wouldn't be as all in on Philly this upcoming year as others might be.
Completely fair, and you do make some good points there. I just maybe think that some of the signings they did make and have brought back might cover up some of those losses better than you may think. We shall see, though. Now, to get into the news that we've kind of all been needing to talk about, but obviously we're kind of waiting on news for it, honestly, is the imminent sale of the Commanders. It has been reported that the Snyders have cleared the building and that the sale will happen at some point in the near future. Obviously, there's not much to currently talk about. There's a few interesting pieces of news. Namely, this week we heard that Magic Johnson is joining a team with Josh Harris, a billionaire who owns multiple other teams and is a Chevy Chase kid, in putting up a bid for the team. And honestly, it's interesting to hear Magic Johnson wanted to buy the team because you wouldn't necessarily think he'd want to reach outside of LA, but maybe it's simply because this is the most interesting and high profile sale currently happening in the NFL. So I don't know if you guys have anything you want to talk about. I have a few names of the people that are bidding on this that I'd like to talk about a bit, but Any notes on the Magic Johnson news, maybe even possibly from you guys?
Well, I mean, just first and foremost, this is a dream come true. It's finally here. We finally get to see a team, fingers crossed that everything goes through. A team no longer under the ownership of Dan Snyder. And that's just something that we really haven't wrapped our heads around yet, or I think fully even realized the impact and the impact of this change that we'll see for years and years to come. This likely means a new stadium, hopefully in DC, within the next decade or so, hopefully sooner. Obviously, we have the FedEx lease, I think, through 2027 or six, I believe. I don't know that off the top of my head. But this is something that we've dreamt of over the years. I myself, I know I speak for all three of us. We don't really know what it's like to be a fan of this team without Dan Snyder ownership and Dan Snyder kind of making a mockery of us across the league. So I'm excited to see the guy go. It's been nothing but embarrassment after embarrassment with him at the helm. Losing season after mediocre season, et cetera, et cetera. So very happy to see Danny Boy go and don't come back. As for, the folks that I think are, going to maybe be buying the team, that's been very hush hush. We've heard obviously Jeff Bezos as a front runner in the beginning, but we've also heard about his, troubled and just quite frankly bad relationship with Dan Snyder, and how those guys don't necessarily see eye to eye, and how they likely wouldn't Snyder anyways likely wouldn't want to do a deal with Bezos. But with Snyder, money is always right. So I guess you can't rule that out completely. Obviously, you mentioned Magic Johnson joining the kind of bid along with Josh Harris, Chevy Chase guy, owns the 76ers as well as a soccer franchise and possibly some other, um, you know, uh, minorities and other teams as well. Mitchell Rails, another guy, a Walt Whitman grad at that. So another local guy in the mix, potentially even with Harris and Johnson, as kind of a group, bid at the team. We'll see how that flushes out. And then even today, as we're kind of on the podcast here, really within the last 15 minutes or so, saw something on my phone pop up about another guy, some Canadian billionaire, obviously a Greek guy. I'm going to try not butcher the last
Good
name.
luck with this name. I mean,
Steve,
as a Greek.
Yeah, as a Greek, I feel shame that I'm gonna butcher this, but Steve Apostopoulos or Apostolopoulos,
Sounds
something
good.
like that. Sounds good
Better
enough.
than me.
Apparently he's in the mix now too. Have toured the facility this week. So there's a lot of names out there for how close it seems like we are to this sale occurring and going through. There's still a lot of names out there. So I couldn't tell you. I could not tell you who it's going to be. All I know is that I'm happy it won't be someone named Dan Snyder.
It is kind of unreal that that things are actually happening. It seems like, a process is actually in place for things to change. And that's just not something that I quite frankly ever actually thought I was going to see happen. However, I also never thought that I'd see the day that the name of the team was changed. So, but things, whether it's for better or worse, things are happening and have happened with this franchise. Now, the one reservation that I might have about, let's say, a local guy coming in and taking the reins. Obviously, that's good if it's somebody that's going to care about the franchise and want it to succeed. Got to remember, Dan Snyder himself was a local guy that was a lifelong fan that wanted to see this team succeed. Now, I think at this point we can definitively say that anybody is going to be better than Dan Snyder as long as they aren't a deplorable human being like Snyder himself. But I also do not want to get an owner that's going to be too hands-on when it comes to football. So hopefully we get somebody that isn't going to be is going to let the people that he hires, take care of the day-to-day things, which isn't always the case with some of these big wig billionaires.
No, Clark, I completely agree with you, and I believe that micromanagement is one of the greatest skills that an NFL owner can have, quite honestly. And that's speaking as a person who sees the NFC East with teams like, the Eagles and the Giants kind of pulling their hands off of the team, whereas you see a guy like Jerry Jones putting his hands on the team almost every single day. And I think that will be important to the Commanders' success is if we have a person who knows when to do both correctly, but more often than not chooses to micromanage. Now, one of the names that I found very interesting personally, and we have our Cowboys friend who also knows this man, Tillman Fertitta, owner of the Houston Rockets, is in the running for a ownership title, along with his group that he's bidding with. I personally find him very interesting. His brothers, Lorenzo and I can't remember the other one's name at this point in time, but Lorenzo Fertitta and the other brother were part of the ownership group along with Dana White, who bought the UFC for around 1 or 5 million and ended up selling it for 7 billion to whoever they sold it to. Interesting name, a guy that's had a little bit of issues with running the Rockets. He's a guy that certainly isn't a micromanager, so that's something I don't like to see. But one of the interesting connections for him is that his father, Frank Fertitta, was known as Frankie Three Sticks and actually had mob connections, was running a lot of casinos known as the Station Casinos in Nevada. So interesting name to see put into this list. I certainly love the idea of Mitchell Rails, Walt Whitman grad. We as well are Walt Whitman grads. So nice to see a local name, and I agree with you, Clark, that it can be a double-edged sword because they might be trying almost too hard or have a few issues like Dan Snyder did. I certainly don't hope that Magic Johnson becomes part of the ownership group, seeing how that Lakers team has gone. I do like the name being involved. However, just not my cup of tea personally. He has his fingers in too many honeypots, and you end up getting diabetes from that much sweetness. But anyways, it'll be interesting to see what happens. I don't think this Canadian billionaire is truly that big of a factor. I did see that news today, but I it just doesn't feel like the right fit to me for some reason. I think that Snyder's going to sell it to someone who either has as much of his heart put into the team as possible, or as much money as he can throw at Snyder as possible. So hopefully we see Harris win the bid. Maybe Mitchell Rails, if he is a part of that group, also becomes part of the ownership. But just interesting to see what will happen. And I think that a lot of the names being thrown around right now are certainly ones to keep a lookout for, especially considering how soon the sale is going to be.
Absolutely. Well, that'll about do it for the episode here today. Happy to be back. Happy to be talking about Commanders. Happy to be back on set with my co-hosts. Definitely have more episodes coming this offseason as things continue to unravel and unfold. I'm Chris with my co-hosts Tom and Clark, and as always, HTTR and HTTC.